Hello, I'm Laura Lynch, and you're listening to The Current.
I was sitting at a karaoke bar. I was looking for a girl to hang out with. Put simply, I was looking for a prostitute. A face of a woman, a girl I bought. I don't know who she is. That is the last thing I remember.
Asurasak Thama was in his native Thailand when he was drugged and kidnapped.
When I woke up, I felt the bedroom shake, so I went outside and saw sea. When I woke up, I was already on a boat. For the next 1 or 2 months, we were at sea. Where would you go? We couldn't flee since we were in the middle of the sea. On the boat, we worked very hard. Sometimes we could only sleep for an hour. Then we would wake up and get back to work. The crew were beaten and scolded by the crewmaster. At sea, he's the boss. Sometimes it was his bare hands. That didn't hurt too much. But the iron rod is very painful. Flesh and iron, they're different.
Asurasak Thama was enslaved on a fishing boat in 2011. He told his story to New York Times journalist Ian Urbina as part of an investigative series. Urbina spent 4 years traveling the world's oceans, investigating lawlessness in the maritime world. He found stories of slavery, piracy, and murder, atrocities committed with impunity because they were committed at sea, hidden from public scrutiny. Ian Urbina's book is called The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier, and he's with me from Washington, D.C. Hello.
Hi there.
How would you describe the scale of the problem you discovered after investigating criminal acts happening at sea?
I'd describe the scale as shockingly broad, and in some ways far broader than we initially expected in terms of the diversity of lawlessness out there. Not all of it bad behavior, but most of it extra-legal behavior.
Well, let's start with this then. Tell me the story of Errol Andrade. Who was he?
So Errol Andrade was a young man from the Philippines. He was very poor and in need of work, and heard through a relative of an opportunity to work on a Taiwanese tuna longliner. He heard by way of what's called a manning agency, which is one of these middlemen firms that specialize in recruiting the workers for these ships and then handling the logistics, typically their airfare and the money they have to put up front to get the job, and then the sort of basics of getting their wages wired back to their family, etc. That's what manning agencies are supposed to do. In Errol Andrade's case, though, that's not what the manning agency did. And at the end of the Errol Andrade story, he left and mysteriously died at sea and came back in a coffin to his family, missing several organs.
So what happened? What did you learn about the agencies that hire people like Errol Andrade?
I learned that many of them are good and do what they advertise, but as many are pretty sort of sketchy outfits. These are sort of P.O. box companies. In this case, the company that recruited Errol was called 123 Step Up Marine, based in Singapore. And sort of the pattern here was that they often recruit these guys. The workers have to put up a fair amount of money to get the job in the first place. The wages in the jobs are dirt poor, even on paper. And then when they arrive on the ship, usually the conditions are far worse than advertised. And then the deductions start rolling in, sort of these hidden expenses that are taken off of their wages. When things go awry, a guy gets hurt, he gets killed. These manning agencies often do not help the family figure out what happened or get the body back or get the individual back. And if the workers are suffering abuse and want to leave their contract early, often the manning agencies keep their entire wages. And so for all of these reasons, it's a pretty abusive system.
So what happened then to Errol Andrade?
It's unclear. The going theory, there was a first autopsy done that sort of posited very thinly that he had died of a heart attack. The second autopsy that was done in the Philippines revealed that he was missing several organs, and he had likely not suffered a heart attack, but sort of some sort of crushing injury. The speculation among other men who were on his ship and other ships was that he was beaten to death or he had fallen from a high place and suffered traumatic injuries. And on the inbound for many of these guys, Errol included, it's very much like a trafficking pipeline that just happens to be incorporated. So these men, when they are recruited into this work, once they're en route, they're not allowed to sort of U-turn and change their mind. In the case of Errol, he was kept in an apartment with an armed guard at the door in Singapore until he could be dispatched to Cape Town, where he was first aboard his ship.
Oh, okay. But he actually signed up for this work. There are others who don't. You also tell the story of Lang Long, who's a Cambodian migrant who wound up working as a slave on a fishing boat in the South China Sea. How did that happen?
Yeah, so much like, a Sorosek or, as you mentioned, the case of Lang Long, in Thailand in specific, there's a pretty robust pipeline of workers, migrant, undocumented, often debt-bonded workers who are coming from Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. Typically, they're recruited on the pretext that they're headed for a construction job, a better-paying land-based construction job. But en route, they usually figure out that that's not where they're destined. They end up at the port. They get marched up onto the vessel. Again, bear in mind, many of these guys are not literate. They don't speak Thai. This is the first time they've ever sort of tried to go after a job across the border. So they're sometimes easily duped. In the case of Lang Long, he ended up on a ship, went off to sea, suffered quite a bit, and attempted to escape while at sea. He jumped overboard and tried to swim to a supply vessel. They caught him, brought him back, and from then forward, he was shackled by the neck when he was not working. And was sold boat to boat over the course of 2.5 years. Ultimately, a anti-trafficking advocate spotted him, raised the funds to purchase him back from the captain who had sort of a debt bondage ownership over him. And Lang Long was rescued, brought to shore, and we interviewed him a couple weeks after that and revealed his story.
What kind of condition was he in?
So he was sold across 3 different boats. He was shackled. He was routinely beaten. These boats in general are pretty unhygienic places, to put it mildly. Roaches and rat infested, workplaces. Usually the men, and some of them are boys. We interviewed some as young as 13, are working 20-hour days, often 6 days a week. So pretty perilous, brutal conditions.
Why is this happening? What is driving that demand for the workers on the fishing boats?
So fishing is a pretty low margin industry, so it's gotten even worse as nearshore stocks have been depleted. And so the economics of fishing, especially in a place like Thailand where there are too many boats, they're under automated in the water. And so these boats have to go very far away, and the economics just don't make sense. So captains and companies generally are finding other ways to save money. And the captains generally rely on sort of trafficked, cheaper migrant workers. And in some cases, they just simply opt not to pay them at all. And if a captain finds himself in a bind where within 2 hours he needs to leave, or the next day he needs to leave, and he's down a man or two, he will put the word out, typically to a labor broker, often tied to karaoke bars or brothels, that he's desperate for a man. Could someone round up a guy quick? And that's usually the scenario in which you have people like Sorosek being shanghaied or drugged at a bar and essentially kidnapped and put on the ship.
Did these workers have any protections?
It varies. I mean, this is a broad, Thailand is not distinct. You'll find, this sort of sea slavery off the coast of Ghana, off the coast of New Zealand, off the coast of the Falkland Islands, Malvinas Islands. In the case of Thailand, it's complicated. I mean, foreign workers in Thailand still are not allowed to unionize. They rarely have translators or advocates who can represent them, and there are huge numbers of them. And so while the government recently has tried to give them identity cards and has tried to implement at-sea inspections on the boats and in port. So far, the efforts have not been super effective because they're still not very good at investigating the actual conditions on these ships.
But are there any United Nations agreements or human rights protections that these people could use?
Sure. I mean, there are a fair number of great laws on the books. I mean, the challenge with the offshore realm, though, is enforcement, right? So, I mean, especially if you're talking about high seas, but even in national waters, laws are only as good as their enforcement. And if there are no inspectors or spot checks or police to really make those laws have teeth, then they're as good as non-existing. And in Thailand, there is a really robust Navy sort of engagement on this. But again, they're not very good at enforcing it. They don't have the sort of experience with doing proper interviews when they board these ships. They don't have the translators, for example, that they need on hand and working for the government to talk with the guys in a way that trust is built. So they're often relying on the bosun, which is sort of the crew master, who's the one guy on many of these ships who speaks both Thai and the language of the crew. And that's also the one person who's doing the abusing. So there are real fundamental flaws in how they attempt to enforce these laws. But in other countries, there isn't even the attempt to enforce many of the laws that exist out there.
So some of the loopholes, though, in maritime law are actually being used by people who are trying to help other people. Tell me about Rebecca Gompertz.
So Rebecca Gompertz is a young woman, Dutch citizen, gynecological doctor. She used to work for Greenpeace. She had witnessed a number of things as a Greenpeace doctor that disturbed her, and she created her own organization called Women on Waves. This is an organization that brings a ship, or in some cases a sailing vessel, to the coast of shores where abortion is illegal and often dangerous for women and girls. And Rebecca and her crew, other healthcare providers, sort of quietly enter national waters, surreptitiously plug into a sort of underground network of doctors who are aware of a number of women and girls in need of access to abortion. And they take these females out to international waters where the law switches over from that of so in this case, when we embedded, it was Mexico. So that of the Mexican government doesn't apply, but rather the law that applies is that of the flag that the ship flies. And in her case, she has an Austrian flag, and so abortion is legal. And she administers a medical abortion, so pills, RU-486, to and all the sort of requisite counseling that goes with such a engagement. And then she quietly delivers the women and girls back to shore. And once their anonymity is secured, she usually holds a press conference to sort of stoke a political debate about the dire need for this service.
And when you were embedded, what did you witness? What was she up against in Mexico?
We struggled to get out of port initially, and the government tried every tactic they could, once they had a suspicion about what she was up to block her administratively. She's pretty experienced at this and knows what they'll attempt, claiming that the crew hadn't entered the country legally, claiming that the ship was not the right type of vessel to bring non-working members aboard, various tactics that they'll try to use. And then subsequently to her press conference, she was then expelled from the country, which is sort of the norm.
You have spent years at sea investigating primarily slavery, murder, piracy. I'm wondering what toll the project took on you personally.
I don't know. Honestly, better to ask my 15-year-old son and my wife that question. I don't know that I have a perspective on it. I mean, I think one thing I do feel like is when you report on this kind of stuff, you feel a certain guilt. It captures you in a certain way in which you feel like you see bad things out there and you get back home to your very comfortable existence, and it motivates you to hurry up and get back out there and continue on the project, because you know all too well about what other people are dealing with in a day-to-day existence and what you're not dealing with. And that, I think, is distinct from other type of reporting I've done, and it's probably the explanation for why I'm still doing it 5 years later, when I was supposed to rotate off the topic about 2 years in. It is a sort of exhausting form of reporting. It's not beat reporting where you do it mostly by phone. This is a pretty difficult space to be working in on these ships, especially if you're there for months on end.
Well, yeah, you found yourself in some very dangerous situations. I'm wondering if there was ever a moment when you thought to yourself, what am I doing here?
Yeah. The danger question is a legitimate question, and I always feel a little bit queasy about answering it in light of the dangers I'm seeing others face day to day, because I get to leave. I have an American passport. I have money. I have these luxuries that make my dangers pale in comparison to even the dangers faced by the sources and other reporters who are in country and have to stay there when I pull out. But yeah, there were multiple times when I thought I had pushed things too far and I might pay a severe price for it. And truth be told, I was most worried about that because I bring people with me and they trust me to deliver them back to shore alive. And the fact that I had that trust and now we were in a potentially deadly situation worried me more than was I going to come out the other side. How was I going to answer to, or have someone else on my behalf answer to my photographer's parents if he didn't make it back to shore? But yeah, and there were, in Borneo and Somalia and a couple places, we got stuck in very potentially violent situations.
But you made it out, obviously.
I did, yeah.
Ian, are you done with this, or are you planning to keep going with this?
Yeah, I'm actually not done. I just committed to another 5 years of this reporting, so I'm just recently launched on a next round of similar reporting around the world.
Well, then all I can say is be careful.
I will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ian Urbina is an investigative journalist and the author of The Outlaw Ocean. We reached him in Washington, D.C.